Excellent. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tom Pickerell. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Tuner Alliance, and this is the latest in a suite of webinars that's been coordinated by the Global Tuner Alliance to support our partners in making progress on meeting the goals of our 5-year strategy. But today, this webinar is jointly hosted with our friends at the Seafood Ethics Action Alliance, or Sea Alliance, and obviously they have a real interest in this issue as well. The webinar today is on migrant worker recruitment and employment. And in particular, it's going to be focusing on a study that's been conducted by the UN agency, International Organization for Migration, or the IOM. And this study was to gather insights in the recruitment and employment experiences of migrant workers employed in the lower tiers of the pre and primary seafood processing sectors in Indonesia and Thailand, obviously countries that are very important to our markets. And so this morning we have Evie van Uden, and we have Alexandra Lasota from the IOM, and they're going to present the findings of the study, and are very keen to hear your reflections on the findings. You will have seen that the webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available to partners of both GTA and Sea Alliance. If I could ask you to keep your microphones on mute when you're not speaking, that would be very helpful. Obviously, we want this to be as interactive as possible. Evie and Alexandra do want to hear your feedback, and I know that they're very keen to answer any questions you may have. You can either just raise your hand, shout them out, or use the chat function, whatever is easiest. I'll keep an eye on the chat function for our presenters. If you joined us during the introduction, welcome, and I'm delighted to introduce Evie and Alexandra. Over to you.
Thank you, Tom, for this brilliant introduction. And I mean, first of all, we are really happy to be here and see all of the participants joining as we speak. I think, yeah, exciting to see all of you and hear from you. So just to also reintroduce myself, my name is Alexandra Lasota, and I am a partnership and program coordinator in relation to our work on migration, business, and human rights. And so we just thought that many of you may not have come across IOM before, so we are going to give you a couple of introductory points about the organization, also the context here in Southeast Asia, and then go straight into the findings of the research that Tom described. So IOM, International Organization for Migration, is a UN agency that was established in 1951. Currently, we have offices in over 100 countries and almost 18,000 staff employed in 523 locations around the world. As of 2021, we had $2.5 billion budget globally. And so our role is really to look at everything that is related to migration. And so our mandate is basically to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration. And so that, of course, includes working with the governments, civil society, but also with private sector. And so the part that myself and Evie are particularly focusing on is basically working with international companies, but also their suppliers in Southeast Asia, not always in Southeast Asia. Actually, our geographical scope very much depends on where companies operate, to look at the protection of migrant workers in global supply chains. And we have looked into your 5-year strategy, and we are really happy to see that GTA actually does recognize that recruitment may be related to some of the risks in relation to forced labor and modern slavery. And this is some of the topic area that you're actively addressing. And so this is a lot on what we work: ethical recruitment, decent work, access to grievances. If we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. And so now just, so that we look at migration in Southeast Asia, which is basically the region where we sit. So it is estimated that there are about 10 million international migrant workers in Southeast Asia. There is, of course, a high occurrence of irregular labor migration. This is often due to the fact that regular migration is often complex. It's often quite expensive. So not every migrant who wants to migrate can afford that or know how to access those channels. And we saw that, of course, COVID-19 has been a major disruption in terms of those recruitment channels, but now in the post-COVID-19 recovery stage, those migration flows are recovering. And migration is also, it continues to be a key driver for development, and also migrants do play a very important role in COVID-19 recovery, mainly meeting some of the labor shortages in countries like Thailand when I sit, and also Malaysia, which are basically the two key countries for destination of migrant workers from the region. Thailand currently is estimated to host about 2 million documented migrant workers, mainly from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Malaysia, about 2 million documented migrant workers, mostly from Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And so let's keep in mind that these are only registered numbers, but most likely these numbers are much, much higher. And then Japan, Korea are key destination countries for workers from Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, with Philippines actually being the largest sending country in ASEAN. And so these are only international flows. In addition to that, there is also internal movements, which we have looked into in the study that we will be presenting to you today. And just in general, I mean, what I think you deal day to day in terms of migrant workers in global supply chains. So ILO estimates that there are nearly 170 million of migrant workers in global supply chains. This is actually more than the combined population of France and Germany. So it's a huge number. Some of the key sectors are, of course, construction, agriculture, manufacturing, domestic work, fishing, seafood processing services, and hospitality. These are mainly lower paid jobs, more manual labor, and are often heavily reliant on migrant workers. And a recent report that was released by IOM, the International Labour Organization, and the NGO called Walk Free, on basically estimates of modern slavery, said that there are around 28 million victims of forced labor, including 15 million in Asia and the Pacific region. So really this region is very much a hotspot for different types of challenges and risks that migrant workers are facing. And unfortunately, in this report, indicated that businesses were responsible for 86% of those cases of forced labor, and migrant workers were 3 times more at risk of becoming a victim of forced labor. And so against this background, we have looked into some of the dynamics and vulnerabilities in relation to migrant workers employed in the pre and primary processing sites in Thailand and Indonesia. And with this, I will hand it over to Evie to take you through the research findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you very much. Nice to meet all of you. My name is Evie van Uden. I'm also sitting in IOM Thailand, and I'm working very closely with Alex on our labor migration and business and human rights portfolio. So as mentioned today, I would like to present you the findings of our study on migrant workers who are employed in the lowest tiers of the seafood processing supply chains in Indonesia and in Thailand. So as you're all aware of, Indonesia and Thailand are both very important producers and exporters of seafood products. And in both countries, these sectors are very relevant and are also employing a large number of migrant workers. So we know that in Thailand, in the sector are many workers from Cambodia and Myanmar, while we know that in Indonesia, there are many internal migrant workers. So as Alex mentioned, when we talk about internal migrant workers, we talk about Indonesians that are migrating within their countries to other parts of the country to seek employment. So in recent years and before, actually, we know that there has been a spotlight on the sector, especially as there were some reports that workers, including migrant workers, faced challenges accessing their labor rights. And based on these, we have seen improvements, both by governments and by businesses, who have actually made very important steps to enhance the labor conditions in the sector. However, something that we have seen is that these improvements are largely made in larger facilities, and that this less trickles down to the lower tiers of the supply chain. So IOM has identified a knowledge gap on the situation of migrant workers who are employed in these lowest tiers. And therefore, we have conducted a study to gather more insights on the situation of these workers. So what IOM aims to do through this study is actually to enhance the evidence base, but also to use these findings to make informed and evidence-based recommendations to stakeholders. So when we talk about stakeholders, we are considering the government, international organizations and CSOs, but also private sector, because we think altogether, if we use an approach that everyone contributes, that we can have a bigger impact to enhance the rights of migrant workers. So today we are presenting to you the findings, as we think that you may be able to provide us with some of your insights and inputs of what you think that private sector actors could also do to enhance the situation of workers in the lower tiers. So I'll just talk you through the research scope and the methodology. So in Indonesia, we're looking at internal migrant workers. In Thailand, we're looking at Cambodian and Myanmar workers. So when we say we're looking at the lower tiers of the supply chain, we're basically looking at 4 types of workplaces and various tasks. So we're looking at pre and primary seafood processing. So this can include, for example, workers who are on the pier, who are loading and on and offloading vessels and other tasks. And we're looking at workers who are cleaning the fish or drying the fish or other seafood products. And for the workplaces, we're looking at pier-based workers, workers employed in home-based locations, as well in small SMEs and in processing garages. So as part of this research, we have interviewed in each of the countries 200 workers. And we have also interviewed relevant stakeholders, including governments, CSOs, and also some business associations. Something to note is that this study focuses on the worker perspective, also to protect the worker. We have not interviewed any of the employers where workers were employed. So we are not sure who is their exact employer. We only know in what kind of workplace they are working and what kind of task they undertake. So this being said, I will move on to the key findings. So first, regarding the workers' migration journey and the documentation that they obtain. So actually in both countries, Thailand and Indonesia, as mentioned, we have seen that the governments have made improvements to enact legislation to protect the rights of workers in this sector. However, in both countries, we still see gaps in the legislation and also a lack of enforcement of these. Regarding the migration journey, as in Thailand, we see migration internationally. We have there noticed that half of the interviewees had used brokers to facilitate their migration. Most of them had support to arrange transportation, which may also point to that migration may have happened irregularly. And as it's international migration in Thailand and domestic in Indonesia, we also saw that the migration cost in Thailand was much higher compared to Indonesia. So in Thailand, we can see that the migration cost particularly spiked during COVID-19, where the borders were closed, and also in 2015 and 2016, and the amount that workers paid was about $500 US. Opposed Indonesia, we saw that workers relatively paid low cost, about $39, and then the cost varies based on the location, on how far workers have traveled. So it indicates that it's for transportation. What we also see in Thailand, where workers need documentation to live and work legally in Thailand, we see that workers had often received the support of brokers to obtain this documentation, for which they were charged excessive fees, which actually amount to around $455 US, which also excessively exceeds the official cost of these documents. Something we also found in Thailand is that 1/5 of the interviewees did not hold any documentation. Regarding the employment in both countries, we found that the majority of workers, except for those employed in small SMEs, was employed on verbal agreements, often on no work, no pay terms. And in both countries, what we also saw was fluctuating work days and fluctuating working hours, which of course also matches with the demands of the sector when there is a lot of seafood to be processed, that there is more work available opposed to other days. So what is the implication of this for workers is that they work over hours or overtime on certain days and do not have sufficient work on other days or other weeks, which is challenging for them to earn their basic, to earn sufficiently to cover their basic needs. Something that also added to this was that both in Thailand and in Indonesia, we saw that many workers are getting paid a piece rate. So they get paid based per like kilo fish they would clean or per number of vessels they would offload, for example. And what we also saw that these workers are getting paid below the minimum wage. So in Thailand, we saw that this amount can be as less as 60% lower than the minimum wage. And in Indonesia, this was as less as 50% of the minimum wage. And in line with this, where workers are earning lower than the minimum wage and are facing difficulties to make ends meet, we also saw that half of the workers are indebted to cover basic needs, such as food and rent and accommodation, and in Thailand as well, documentation and healthcare. Regarding the safety and healthcare of the workers, in both countries, we found that workers have limited access to occupational safety and health. And despite needed, most workers had to buy their own personal protective equipment. And we also found in both countries that workers are facing challenges to access social security, as in both countries, in Indonesia, 4/5 was not registered in social security schemes. And in Thailand, this was 2/5. And what we also found in Thailand was that even though for some workers, their wages are actually deducted 5%, which is mandatory deduction by the government to the Social Security Fund, when workers actually went to the hospital, they were told that they were not enrolled in the Social Security system. Something we also found among workers is that there is a lack of knowledge among them of grievance mechanisms they can reach out to if they face any challenge, and also a lack of unionization, which is quite common in the region and also in Thailand, for example, because there is legislation restricting workers to migrant workers to start their own union. In both countries, we also identified gender inequality, where women are employed in the more precarious workplaces. And in Indonesia, we also identified a gender pay gap. In Indonesia, there were a few cases identified where workers' documents were being retained and where workers were being faced unpaid wages and were also threatened of blacklisting in case they would be leaving their employment. So this is a very quick overview of the findings that we had. And as you may note, these are not that positive. So we think that it's very important that we take steps to address these. So we would like to make recommendations, both, as I said, to the government, to CSOs, and also to private sector actors. So we are actually very interested to learn from you, to reflect on the findings, whether you knew of these or whether these are new to you, and what you think that buyers of Thai and Indonesian seafood and fish could do to address the issues that we have just presented. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Evie. So, great overview of the report's findings. And now what we'd like to do is open it up for just a bit of feedback from attendees. And we'll keep these 4 questions on the screen, but I just wondered if anyone has any thoughts on any of the questions. And you can either use the chat function or pop your hand up or just shout out. Just to prompt you, are any of these findings new to people?
Tom, good morning. It's David at Prince's here. Good morning, ladies. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. To get things rolling and answer your question, no, I would say in terms of not necessarily the specific numbers, but the general issues that have been presented doesn't come across as new or as a surprise. I would say it's a affirmation of existing challenges that we know are out there.
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else going to add to Dave's comments on that one? No. Okay. So the next question that the team have is, what could the buyers of such seafood from Thailand and Indonesia do to address these challenges? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Has anyone heard anything that has worked in the past or anything that hasn't worked in the past? I'm aware that this might be a bit sensitive for some companies, so feel free to pop things in the chat to me and I can read them out anonymously if that is something you'd prefer to do.
Tom, and maybe just also to add from our end. So basically everything that is shared today, any feedback or any suggestions or any recommendations, we are not going to be mentioning that they came from a certain company or a certain person. So you can, rest assured that this is going to be consolidated simply as a feedback from private sector. And, we know that all of the companies that are here, you are already committed and you're doing a lot. And we also work day to day with our private sector partners, both international brands, but also some of tier 1 suppliers here in Thailand. And I think that a lot of the times that discussion that we have is really how do we effectively look at the bottom of the supply chain. And so often the discussion revolves around responsible purchasing practices, but then the question is how do you replicate responsible purchasing practices in tier 3, tier 4, or sometimes in those really gray areas that we have covered here. And so what would be really interesting based on your experience, but also what you hear from other companies operating in the industry is, are there any practices that do work in terms of reaching the bottom of the supply chain? Are there any kind of practices to incentivize compliance, or also how, for instance, some of the companies are dealing with some of the legal challenges, because we know that often contracts reach only tier 1. Sometimes through that compliance requirements, they may reach tier 2. But then what happens with the rest of that? So that's why, it's just, it's an open discussion, and we are really approaching you because I think we don't know yet how to address this question in a way that actually provides practical recommendations that can be implemented. And we would like to, we would like to have just generic recommendations for private sector, but also for the government in terms of increasing enforcement of legislation, monitoring, and so on. So these are all kind of just, I think, food for thought in case some of you maybe are thinking or are discussing similar topics with the partners in this group or outside of it.
Deborah, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi there. Apologies. I'm having trouble with Zoom, so very sorry. It's more a question really than an observation, really, because this is my first interaction with GTA at M&S. Did the study, so the question is, did the study have any interaction with ISARA Institute and the mechanisms that they have in place in terms of ethical recruitment corridors and so on?
Great question. Thank you, Deborah. Evie or Alexandra, who would like to take that one?
Yeah, I can take this one. So this one does not have interaction with our institute because we have mainly engaged through civil society organizations, the ones who are the first respondents to all of the challenges that migrant workers are raising. And so in terms of the work that ISARA Institute does, in a way that it kind of interacts or is kind of that link between brand and suppliers, and then interacts with migrant workers, this is very similar to the way that we operate in terms of understanding some of those challenges in specific supply chains. So this is just to answer to your question.
Thank you. Deborah, do you have any follow-up before we jump to Dave, or is that good?
No, I think that's clear in terms of the scope of the study. I suppose it's some of the mechanisms that they have in place may be interesting solutions. But no, it was really just to understand that better. So that's clear. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Dave.
Thanks, Tom. I had a question for the IOM really in terms of, if you were doing the study, obviously there's a lot of focus, and rightly so, in terms of interviewing the workers, but did you have many, if I missed this, I'm sorry, did you have any conversation with the processors? I'm interested in terms of how they recruit. So we've got the word agents, and nobody particularly likes an agent, but my view would be that they're a sort of a necessary, well, not a necessary evil, hopefully, but a necessary conduit. But did you get a sense whether the processing companies are themselves investing time to go out to the source countries? And from our perspective, forgive me, it sounds like an advert, but it isn't. So we have factories on Mauritius, and we will recruit from Bangladesh. But every time there is a recruitment drive, the HR manager goes physically with the agent. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that that means we're completely risk-free. I'm not naive or an idiot. Well, I'm one of those things, but I'm not naive. But it helps reduce, we think, risks by having that in-country presence and being there physically doing it. So do you get a sense whether some of these processes are just outsourcing everything to an agent and people arrive, or are they going themselves? Are they part of the process? Are they physically seeing people and talking to them before they come to work?
Ivy, thank you for the question. Ivy, do you want to start, and then I can add up to it?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your question. And indeed, that would be the good practice if you would be hiring migrant workers directly from the country of origin to actually go there and oversee the recruitment process. Something that we found in this study among the workers that we interviewed is that actually most of them have crossed the border, at least in Thailand, they crossed the border by themselves. And then they found the employment only once they were in Thailand. And due to the challenges that they face to seek employment, and also the systems to obtain the legal documentation are quite complicated and difficult to access for workers, they often end up with brokers or middlemen who help them to seek employment and to obtain this documentation. So these workers were not recruited in the country, but they came to Thailand first, and then they found their employer upon arrival.
So I suppose in a way, so it's not so much a follow-up question, but more a thought. It seems to me that for the processing companies, there's almost a get out here of, you know, they're not really taking responsibility, are they? In many ways, people are arriving, working with them, but it's, forgive my phrasing here, but it's almost, how do they get to Thailand? I don't know. That's not my problem. I wasn't responsible for them coming here. It seems to me that lack of accountability, I guess.
I think that's a very valid point, Dave. And so also just to add what Evie said, this study is very unique in a way that it really looks at down deep in the supply chain. So actually the practices that you have described, we see it a lot with tier 1, sometimes tier 2. And there are a lot of good practices. Really, a lot of companies just made a lot of efforts to, as you mentioned, send someone to the country of origin of migrant workers to be there. But then what happens is that in the tiers that we have looked, it seems that some of those employers maybe are too small, or maybe those workers they often are part-time, so they are not full-time workers, so they are a bit treated as a commodity that kind of comes and goes. And so this is exactly where that lack of accountability is. And so, yeah, so we are kind of trying to find how some of the practices that you just described could also be incentivized in those lowest tiers. But this is where the gap is, because there has been a lot of improvement that I think everyone recognizes in tier 1, tier 2, but it seems that not that much changed at the bottom of these supply chains, in more kind of gray areas. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. I've got a bit of feedback on the chat, then I'll jump to Mike. What can brands do? First off, it's important to start talking to factories about recruitment fees and what the brand's expectations are. For example, employers pays principle. Many factories seem still not to have caught onto the fact that legislation is pushing foreign buyers to address modern slavery in their supply chains. Don't simply accept factory blanket statements such as "we'll cover all recruitment fees going forward," as it will not really happen. Engage factories and push them to educate themselves about recruitment fees and processes, and come up with detailed plans around what type and when they can cover recruitment fees. So that's a bit of feedback for you there. I'll cut and paste that into a direct comment to the IOM team.
Thank you. That's very useful.
Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks for the presentation, guys. I think just to recap on question one, and to kind of reiterate what Dave's just said, I think you'd have to be naive or foolish not to know that there were challenges and risks in these type of supply chains. Some of the figures, the percentages, are obviously new to me anyway, and quite alarming. But my interaction here is really as another question rather than giving you any answers, I'm afraid. And it comes back. I might have missed this, and if I have, I'm sorry. But I think you refer to lower tier manufacturers in the build up to this, and I think I just heard the comment about improvements made in tier 1 and tier 2 factories. Now, I'm not quite clear what you mean by lower tier. How many businesses, their scale. And the question I had really was the role of third-party certification in that sector. How many of these factories would be having, independently audited third-party inspections, such as those that come along with certification standards like food safety standards, etc. So that would be useful context to help kind of sort of see how this risk sits against the larger, more modern and well-invested plants that tend to be the sort of supply chains used by European buyers. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, I think it does. It makes a lot of sense. And so I think, what I'm describing as tier 1, tier 2 suppliers are the European buyers that you potentially have in mind. And so these are usually the big Indonesian, big Thai companies that have direct legal relationship with it's either a European buyer or a retailer, basically anyone who is based outside of Thailand or Indonesia. And now in terms of the size of the businesses that we have looked at, I don't know, Evie, do you want to maybe mention on that? Because I know that we actually have been looking at the definitions of each country, what SMEs mean.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, it's relatively small businesses. So it's the pre and primary seafood processing sector. So it's really like workers are on the pier who are unloading and offloading the vessel. We have looked in home-based workplaces. So it's unclear also who is their direct employer. And we also look at SMEs. And when we talk about small SMEs, we actually talk about companies that employ less than 50 workers. So during the interview, workers were also asked how many colleagues were in their workplace, and that was also below 50. So we are really talking about small undertakings. And yeah, as Alex mentioned, this is the lower tiers, and it's also often unclear, I think, who is the employer. As I said, we have only interviewed the workers. We have not had the direct conversation with the employer. So we don't know to which company these workers belong, and also not if they are recruited directly by the employer or if there's a middleman or a broker who sends workers to different companies, for example. Something that we noted, except for the SME workers, is that these companies often have a workforce that they employ on a permanent basis. And then when there is more demand for seafood, they employ daily workers. So these workers often fall under daily workers. So it's also possible that these workers are rotating between different companies based on the demand and the work available.
Thanks for that clarification. And Tom, if I may, just to reflect on that answer, those answers, which I think, they filled in my knowledge gap there. Thank you for that. So reflecting on that, there is still a potential risk, I think, of product from those supply chains somehow or other entering the supply chains of the higher tier factories, whether that be outwork or through outsourced contracting. So I guess there's the residual risk, but you can see the huge amount of work that's happened over the last, I would say, 10 years or so in the direct supply chain for retail. What we're really talking about here, perhaps, is a levelling up of standards across a whole sector. So what have we learned in the tier 1 and tier 2 sort of supply chains that could play out across the whole sector? And part of that might be thinking about how industries interconnect outside of the direct, the typical supply chain, and making sure that any local transactions and local sort of purchases and contractual arrangements carry the same kind of requirements as the direct supply chain to a UK retailer or a European retailer. That's going to be difficult because those kind of anomalies and inequities exist in many supply chains, not just in food, not just in seafood. It's a global challenge. As you guys, this is what you do. This is your bread and butter. So you'll be aware of that. It's not going to be easy. It's not even easy here in the UK to get the same standard across the whole of the seafood sector through all its many different parts and sectors and geographies and regions. It's really challenging. So as a short answer to your sort of bottom 3 questions are, well, certainly the middle 2 is don't expect a silver bullet. There is nothing we can do that is going to fix this overnight, but mostly it's about awareness raising and dissemination of good ideas and best practice, and businesses reaping the benefits of doing that. So, if you're doing something well, you're protecting your market share, you're securing your supply chain, you're securing your profitability. So, and that can only be done on the ground in these nations. We can't do that from London. We can't do it from Manchester. It has to be on the ground when we're out there working with the direct suppliers. I'm not going to answer the question about governments because that's not. I don't really understand lobbying, but I guess there could be a collective voice of seafood buyers that could be brought into play through the likes of GTA, but that's a longer discussion, I think. Thanks for that. I appreciate your input and feedback. Thank you very much.
Tom, you're on mute.
Yeah,
but yeah, very, very, very valid inputs. And we know that there is no silver bullet, unfortunately. So we are trying to find a number of factors that we can bring together to actually push the needle.
Thank you. We've had a question via chat. Do IOM think that the IRIS system that you have developed is actually offering practical help to factories and buyers? We've seen factories use it as cover, and there is no real way to hold them accountable against it.
Yeah, I can take this question. So basically the IRIS system has been developed specifically for recruiters. And so, we are happy to report that the first recruiter has been certified this year. It's a recruiter from Singapore, which basically means that, they have proven that they reach a certain level of maturity in terms of their practices. And so because simply the areas where those recruiters have been operating don't always have legislation that would be looking at ethical recruitment. So because complying with IRIS standard really means complying with some of the international labor standards, the ones that have been established by ILO with the Private Employment Convention, but then also ILO operational guidelines on fair recruitment, it takes a while for recruiters to change their policies and then demonstrate the impact and actually practices. So to answer your question, I think that if suppliers and buyers are dealing with certified recruiters, I think that of course they can expect a certain level of compliance with that IRIS standard. But as is the case with all other compliance systems and certifications, of course, recruiters need to be audited on a regular basis. So in that respect, yes, but IRIS is a certification system, and right now also has been transforming a bit into sort of an initiative, driving collaboration with the governments and trying to kind of advance that discussion on how to mainstream ethical recruitment in some of the national legislation. But so in that way, it can be useful. And I also would be happy, if you're not already in touch, put you in touch with our colleagues working on IRIS in the HQ, because I think they will be, of course, the best positioned to, to address some of the questions and comments that there may be.
Right, thank you. So if you do have any specifics on IRIS, what I can do with Evie's permission is I can put Evie's email address in the chat so that you've got that, if that's okay with you, Evie.
Yes, definitely.
Lovely. Dave.
Thanks, Tom. It was just a thought when he popped in terms of something that Mike said, which I think was very very accurate. I mean, obviously there's not a quick fix, much as wish there was. The awareness raising thing is probably the most powerful thing that we can do. Now, it sounds, I do worry that saying things like awareness raising is very easy to say, and you do wonder how effective it is. But I'm conscious that as I look at my business, we went through this probably, I don't know, 2-3 years ago when we established a separate migrant worker policy. We did webinars, all of our traded suppliers, which included suppliers in Thailand, all attended, but we probably haven't gone around that and banged the drum again enough, which is something that I think we all have the responsibility as brands or as retailers in this country to do. So it's something that we're looking at the moment, which we know we need to put more effort into again in 2023 to hammer these messages home with suppliers. I do worry a little bit as to whether, because if we don't do that, I have a feeling that suppliers think, well, these UK companies, they say something, then they disappear, and then we don't hear from them for a while. And yes, there's SMETA audits going on as well, but I think we probably just need to have a more concerted, whether it's a campaign that's organised across industry or just all as a collective of individuals, we commit to redoubling our efforts. I think that's the most important thing to do. Two things on that. I do recall from a couple of years ago that some of the feedback we got was, as we get in many things in change around the world, you're the only people asking, most of our customers don't. So when you get this, you often get this feedback of, if you're a small portion of my business, I can't change my business for 5% or probably less in most cases. So this is an issue that also spreads into retailers maybe in Thailand and Southeast Asia as well that are sorting from, which I realize are very difficult for us to comment on or influence, but we do sometimes get that feedback. I also, just as a general point, do wonder whether the processors think we'll never recover the money for this. Now, we've definitely said to our suppliers when we did this first launch a couple of years ago, we know this will add cost to your business. We consider it a cost of doing business with you, no different from your cost of energy or the cost of the raw material. So we would expect that to be passed on. But I don't know whether they really believe that businesses in the UK or in Europe will really pay for that, because we've got commercial imperatives hanging over us all the time. But I think that message needs to be made quite clear that this is a cost of doing business, and this is a cost that for a processor, its customers should be accepting. Although, if I may, I know I'm being long-winded, if you go back to that other point that other companies don't ask us, they will probably balk at the idea of paying more for recruitment fees. I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit, but one last one. On the government one, that's a tough one, blimey. But the thought I would suggest there is let the government follow the money. Regularization and more state control means tax. That means money. I'm not sure there's much of a will from governments to do the right thing, but if there's money at the end of it, so I don't know whether there's a case that could be built up. I'm sure it's been presented before in terms of more state control and regularization of this, whether it's agents or whether it's the flow of migrants themselves, then this money will stop ending up in the black economy and will end up in the state coffers. Sorry, it was a bit long-winded.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Yeah, we took note of all the points. I think, yeah, very, very useful. And it's also really good to, to hear the reflections from all of you on some of these points.
So we've got just over 10 minutes left, but I'm aware that, it's a very busy time of the year for the supply chain. So if there's any final points anyone would wish to raise, you can see that it's been a combination of questions, comments, feedback, and I think it's all been very helpful to Alexandra and Evie. So if anyone has anything else to add, whether it's in the chat or make a comment, now's your chance. No. Okay. Well, I hope that was good feedback for you both, and I hope for the GTA partners and the C Alliance members that it was very interesting to hear about the study. It would be good to keep in contact and find out how the recommendations for the report are developed, and maybe if you're able to share the draft recommendations, we could circulate, because maybe that will stimulate further thoughts in like a second round of feedback, if that would be useful.
I think that would be definitely useful, Tom, and thank you so much for having us and organizing this. And also, in case there are any additional inputs or questions, please feel free to reach out to us also bilaterally, and we will be happy to incorporate them, but then also answer your questions. And I think we also would be really interested to see whether some of these recommendations can also add to the implementation of your 5-year strategy. Because I mean, with all of this research, I think it really becomes important the moment that recommendations are actually implemented in practice. So we hope to see uptake of recommendations, I think, going forward.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. And I will be sharing the recording with all of our partners. So there may be some further feedback that comes back from people who are able to review the recording. So on that note, I will wrap up and say thank you very much for everyone for joining our webinar, and a special thanks for Alexandra and Evie for presenting in such a clear way. If you have any thoughts, feedback, comments, or anything that comes to you afterwards, please drop me a line. Karen Green as well for C Alliance Partners has been participating again. Me and Karen are working on this together. So thanks very much, everyone. And I'll get the recording and sent around. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides so I can include them as well?
Definitely, we will send them afterward.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Hope everyone has a lovely day today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.